order and take attendance.
Alderman Kenny?
Here.
Rummel?
Present.
Skidmore?
Here.
Revere? Wood?
Here.
Sodlin?
Here, okay, we have a quorum. We'll go through our usual procedure to create a consent agenda by saying which items people would wish separate consideration on. So, 21. Thank you. Number one. Any others? 24 we'll have to for sure. 23 and 24. 21, 23, 24, and 1. Ah, good. Alderman Revere is here for any additional ones. Mike, we've already give them to you in order. We've already had separation on 1. And then we jump all the way to the last page. 21, 23, and 24.
Thank you, Mayor. So it's my turn for additional separations.
If there are any.
Thank you. I do have others. I was hoping for an update on the recommendations that the CDBG had on their meeting this afternoon for agenda items 13, 15, 16, and since we have so few collective bargaining agreements, I was hoping for a quick update from Labor Relations on item 18 as per our custom here. And I believe the last one then would be item 22, please.
Okay, so we've had request for separation on 1, 13, 15, 16, 18, 21, 22, 23, and 24.
Attorney May says 19. I had that marked too, but figured that if no one else requested it by now, everyone else understands the difference between the alternate substitute and the substitute.
All right,
So
we
I
have
figured
19
President
we have-
Rommel was going to.
We have
make
19
clear.
as well.
Okay.
So I'll take a motion, please, for adopting the recommendations on 2 through 15, 14,
13, 2 through 12, 13.
2 through 12, yeah. Isn't that what you said? 2 through 12, 14, 17, and 20.
Move approval of the
Move suspension.
2 through 12, 14, 17, and 20.
Suspension to take those items up.
Suspension of the rules to take
Is there
up.
a second?
Second.
On suspension, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Motion to adopt those items would be in order now.
Move adoption of items 2 through 12, 14, 17, and 20.
I'll second, though. I believe the recommendation for item 20 should be to place on file without prejudice.
Right. Adopt the report. On the question, is there a second?
Second.
There is. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Item number 1, is there a motion, please?
Move approval of the extension of the appointment of Matt Wachter.
Second. Discussion.
I pull this, Mayor, and, you know, Matt said this is the 5th time we have extended this provisional appointment. I just would like to get an update on when he gets to go back to what he was hired to do, and presumably that's what he wants to do, more than what he's doing now. Natalie Erdman, thank you.
So he is doing what he was hired to do, plus a bit more. So this provisional appointment had him continuing to do the work at the CDA redevelopment, which he had been doing previously, but he's doing it at a higher level than he was previously. And he's continuing to work on the housing report. The intention is to rewrite that job description for the CDA so that it more closely matches the work that he is currently doing and make it permanent. So you will not see his provisional appointment again.
So
We
we'll
will
just see a
resolve that.
reclass, and presumably Mr. Wachter would be assigned to that.
Correct.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Thank you.
Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Item 13. Is there a motion, please?
Move approval.
Is there a second?
Second, I have no objection to combining 13, 15, and 16 together. Again, my purpose was to hear a report from Jim as to what CDBG Commission's recommendation was from this afternoon.
Is there any objection to combining the three items into the main motion of 13, 15, 16? Seeing none, it'll be
Four
before
items,
us.
yeah.
You want 17 in there too?
No, it's
No.
12, although it's not noted on our agenda. 12 was at CDBG at noon today,
Okay.
as was 13, 15, and 16. Right, that's.
Okay. The
So those
report they're
four.
requesting then, Jim?
So
Okay.
the CDBG committee failed to get quorum Thursday night when those items would normally have been taken up, and knowing that they were on, or hoped to be on the agenda before the finance committee. Tonight, we called a special meeting and met at noon today, at which each of those items, 12, 13, 15, and 16, were approved by the CDBG committee. I think they were all, well, they were unanimous votes with one abstention on one of the items. I think the abstention was on item 15.
Thank you, Jim. So in other words, no further recommendations, no amendments, and anything were proposed?
Just note that for item 15, it was the substitute
Right,
amendment that was recommended for adoption.
The substitute isn't noted on our agenda, but it is in our packets.
And really, the only difference between the original resolution and the substitute is that we thought it would be worthwhile in the substitute to identify each and every one of the current contracts that will expire at the end of 2017, and the funds that have been allocated to them would be made available through the current RFP for use in 2018. And what is not on that list is the $170,000 for street outreach services that was part of an RFP process earlier this year. Also, what's not on that list is $110,000, which is money that by previous action of the council and budget action has been assigned to the to support the operation of the county daytime resource center.
Great, thank you very much.
Further questions? Seeing none. On the report, the motion, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. That takes us to 18. Have a motion, please?
Move adoption of and confirming the agreement between the City of Madison and the Association of Madison Fire Supervisors for the period of January 1st, 2016 through December 31st, 2017.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Discussion.
If I could just have the quick review of the collective bargaining agreement from Labor Relations. I'd appreciate it, Greg. Luckily, we got you very quickly tonight, unlike last time when I pulled you. So. If you'd rather not go through the entire 7 points in your written report, are there anything you'd like to highlight? And are there any?
It mirrors, the settlement with the fire supervisors mirrors what we did with the police supervisors as far as wages and health care is concerned. A couple of things, the vacation sellback is new. It reflects what Local 311 has, so it's a parity issue there. The clothing allowance was adjusted because the clothing allowance referred to what the clothing allowance was in 2007. While we've been adjusting it through the years, we don't have an accurate number in there, so now we're bringing that number up to date. And the Sunday premium duty pay, that's a call-in. When they're on duty pay, they're on call or on standby, and they're guaranteed a minimum there. And lastly, the legal protection language that's being added is from a direction by Mike May, and we added that to the MPPOA and police supervisors contract too.
To clarify, the duty pay, the Sunday premium and duty pay, that's not a new concept? What's new is the minimum, or is it a new?
It's the minimum that's new. They've always had duty pay, but they haven't had a minimum there before.
No, it's Either 3 or 2 hours.
It's 3,
Oh, I see, unless the 2 hours of work overlaps
correct.
a workday. Okay, thank you. And I presume this was unanimously ratified already by
It was.
AMPS?
Yep.
Thank you.
Further questions or discussion? Seeing none, on the question of adoption, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Motion on 19. Is there a motion?
A motion for the substitute, establishing procedures for application of the ResJ Equity Impact Analysis tool to identified budget projects.
Are we moving the substitute or the alternate substitute?
I'm not sure.
The one that I think everyone is in agreement on is what is called here the alternate substitute.
put-
It
yes.
should be called the second alternate.
So I'll take it as the alternate substitute, the second
Second alternate.
substitute, correct?
Substitute.
Great.
Second.
Is there a second? There
Second.
is. Discussion.
Do you want to explain the differences quick? I appreciate the email you sent all of us late last week about it, but
Well, basically, we tried to simplify what we were trying to do to, rather than put things in the budget. This does 3 or 4 things that we think are important to move the RESJI program forward. First of all, it adopts the process guide and the tool as formally adopted by the council to be used. It calls for training of a lot of city officials, including elected officials and department and division heads by next year so that everyone understands how to work it, or how it works and how to apply it. Calls for a report on capacity, which has been something the council has asked about. And finally, a follow-up report just on how the things in the resolution operated during the next year. Part of the reason we pulled the budget out is the mayor gave a directive to department and division heads to include some of those things in the capital budget, so you'll see that already anyways.
thank you.
Further questions, discussion? Alderman McKee.
Thank you. Would you say more about the capacity?
The members of the council and others have asked the question that if we're going to be applying RSJI analysis on a broader basis, do we have sufficient capacity in terms of employees to be able to do that? And I know that DCR has already been looking at that and has started to look at it. And so what the resolution calls for is to get a report on that that says, what do we have, what do we need if we're going to be doing this on a more regular basis? Tori might be able to speak a little more to that, but.
Yes, please.
And so our intention is between now and September, which I think is when the final decision will be made, we're actually looking at completing our capacity report. We recognize right now under the current structure that RESJI currently resides, we don't have the capacity to maintain with the additional ask. What I'm doing right now is going to each of the departments just to go back to even 2016 and inquire on the equitable workforce plan just with the 3 tool usage. Now, with the budget piece, which we took out from the resolution, with that additional ask, we recognize that with the tools that departments are currently using, coming from elected officials, wherever tools are currently coming from. It doesn't just have to come just with the tools from the ask from the budget. Tools come from anywhere. Tool usage come from anywhere. Equitable hiring tools, racial impact analysis tools. With that, we have a process that comes in with that. So whenever we get them, there's a process. They come through the tools person who managed those right now is Melissa Gumbar. It used to be Jordan. We send them out to our tools and training team. Now, if people on that team cannot support that request because they may be on 2 or 3 other tools, we send it out to the broader team, which is the core team. If folks on the core team is not able to support that request, it falls squarely back on me. I can only do so many on so many teams in addition to the other meetings that I'm attending and other things that I'm responsible for. That means we have a capacity issue, right? Because the work that everyone else is doing is their 9-to-5 work, which is their daily work responsibilities based on their classifications. So the capacity report will give us the ability to say, how can we continue to support the work of racial equity impact analysis amongst everything else that we're doing? Every department should have a department equity team to help support the work of doing racial equity analysis. That's what I'm going around right now, trying to shore up, where are you with your department equity teams? Do you have an equity workforce plan? Meaning that, do you have your plan together on how are you going to support the work of doing tool analysis in your department? I know who have those teams and who don't. If you don't have a team established, you're going to have an extremely hard time supporting that work. And so that's one. But two, beyond that, we still need the capacity to support those teams with additional bodies who is dedicated to supporting that along with me.
So a follow-up question, with the delays, if there's not a team in place within a department, is there projected, the delay to that particular project? I mean, if you're passing on to the first line and they're busy and you pass it on, what's the potential time lag that, I mean, it could be general. I just want to get an idea if it's 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months. And I'm trying to get a sense of how that impacts the timeline of something that's moving through the system.
Typically what happens is we might put out a request, we may not hear anything, it will be crickets on the email. Typically I will jump on just to get things moving. Someone will jump on from the tools and training team just to get things moving to establish a timeline. However, the analysis may or may not happen. We'll have them go through the scoping process, which is the process guide that we took the original resolution back to. The tool application of it may not happen if we cannot find a technical expert to do it with them if they don't have it. It may or may not happen depending on the need of the project or the need of the analysis. We have turned some down because we can't support it.
My final question is, in order to put the analysis and all these systems in place, is there a start timeline? I mean, my question is, when we're looking at a project that has to go through the tool, what is the preliminary time that someone should submit that request? I mean, sometimes I've seen requests in the middle when the process is already started. And so hopefully this procedural manual, and I want to know, does it address that? Does it say if there's a project that needs to work through that process, how much lead time we need to be looking at so a project will not just go through and you already know that you're not going to have ample time for it to work through those processes, which you may or may not have control over. That makes sense.
Right. Well, the process guide talks about the best practices of when we should be entering into a racial impact analysis. Ideally, depending on what type of, if it's a policy decision, if it's a contract, or if it's a desk exercise, we should be entering into those processes upstream, meaning, for example, we just looked at the Madison Park plan. That was a very good example. It was so far upstream where we were just talking about pre-RFP process, where we were talking about what are the questions or what are the things that we want to put into the RFP before we go to developing it. That's a great example. That's a good example of when we would want to start, ideally, looking at a racial impact analysis. That's just one example. As far upstream as possible, we're looking at the community gardens for Sheboygan. George is doing a wonderful job. And so there are several things that's already happened, and now they're at the engagement peak. So that's another wonderful opportunity to look at. When do you start a racial impact analysis, right? He's at a very good point. So now this is another opportunity to start a tool usage for a racial impact analysis. That's a good time to start that part. He's at the public participation part, and so now we're entering in. So there are good opportunities to start in. The idea is that the best practice is you don't want to start with more than a part of a project or a decision has already been made. That's when you want to say, hey, if we've decided so many percentage of something, then we don't want to be doing it, because then that's a transaction.
Thank you.
Further questions or discussion? Alderman Rommel?
I appreciate the work that everyone's put into this, because at some point, when we first heard about it, there were just so many questions, and I think this sort of smooths us through working as a process. And I just want to thank everybody for your work on this, and well, it's kind of a work in progress.
Thank you.
Further questions, discussion? Seeing none on adoption, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Item 21, is there a motion, please?
Move adoption of strengthening and expanding community empowerment through placemaking in key neighborhoods, and authorizing a contract with Project for Public Spaces for placemaking training.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Motion is second. Let me take a few minutes here to go into some depth about this. Madison's got about 120 neighborhood organizations. If we were to look at the impact of them over the years, we would know that some of them are far more effective than others. They have greater resources, they have more activism. There's a whole host of reasons that then leads them to greater success within the city of Madison, whether it may be the actual performance of life in their neighborhood, or it's tapping into city resources. Now, we were one of the first cities to become involved in placemaking as a technique in regards to our neighborhoods. And we've got plenty of examples of that within the city of Madison. While it wasn't recognized as placemaking at the time, one excellent and notable experience was the State Street Mall. Now, let's now go from that to a discussion about community organizing. Most community organizing in the United States today is based off the work of Saul Alinsky. And while there's a lot more to understand about it, there's certainly one premise in his work, which was do not do for people what they can do for themselves. And so that's been one of our premises. But I want to point out that the city of Madison does not have an extensive history in terms of community organizing. There have been some organizations that have put efforts in to this topic, ranging from the Community Action Commission to the folks that have come through. Now I'm blanking on the name of the federal program which makes available folks who, among other things, can do it. But in any case, we don't have, at least with city support, much of a history in this area. One of the things that we did in the 1990s, and we continue to this day, is to have activated our neighborhood resource teams. And the neighborhood resource teams, in effect, have followed some of the principles that come from Saul Alinsky's notion that you don't do for people what they can do for themselves. It's partially inspired by the work of John McKnight at Northwestern University's Urban Affairs Department, namely the notion of capacity building, that if you really want to build strong neighborhoods, what you do is you build off the strengths and the assets of the neighborhood. And we certainly have had some success with the NRTs. The turnaround at Vera Court, the turnaround at Truex, the turnaround at the Triangle are all examples. And one of the things that we've learned over the years in the efforts of the NRTs is that the NRTs are most effective when there is a strong neighborhood presence. When there is not, the NRTs are not as effective, and they cannot be a substitute for neighborhood activism. That doesn't mean that we don't have NRTs in these areas, but again, they just simply cannot be as effective. Now, in discussions with Fred Kent, who's the director of the president of the Project for Public Spaces, and with Marshall Gans, who's well-known in terms of the work he's done on community organizing, I came to the conclusion that one of the things, and this is sort of a chicken and egg thing, one of the things that we've seen happen in Madison is where there has been a successful placemaking experience. That experience itself, in terms of attracting the attention of people in the neighborhood, ends up providing ongoing interest and activism among those people, and that they continue it beyond the specific placemaking project. So, I inquired from the Project for Public Spaces what they would recommend, and it's contained in the proposed contract. Now, question has been asked as to whether or not this training can be done by our own plan department. And while we've got experienced people in the plan department who are familiar with placemaking, and I've got my own experiences over the years, I would prefer and would recommend that we bring in the very best. Project for Public Spaces is in a league of its own. Its leadership has been at this for 40 years, and the people we're talking about who would lead this activity have thousands of hours of experience in doing the training. And I think that their experience shows up in one of their key recommendations. Now, in terms of this training, they felt that it was important, as did I, that we give the training to the city staff who most often interface or interact with the neighborhoods in question. That's the NRT people. But it's their recommendation that the training for the people in the neighborhood and the city staff not be held in the same session. And the reason is that their experience is that when the public employees are in the same sessions with the neighborhood people, they cannot but help to, in effect, dominate the discussion, and it weakens the educational process for the people in the neighborhood. So the proposal here is to have separate sessions. One of their other recommendations is that the training be in the neighborhoods itself. Now, we have to figure out exactly how many neighborhoods are in question here. We're thinking somewhere anywhere from 6 to a dozen, and unfortunately, we can't do 10 or 12 separate sessions, but we can at least separate out east side, west side, get sessions as close as possible to the people in question who would get the leadership training in placemaking, and in the course of all of this, also provide transportation where required child care and other such activities. I initially thought that this would be an appropriate use of some of the $400,000 that we'd set aside on the 15-point plan for this year that we are not going to spend all of before the end of 2017. But two considerations. One is I've read the language in the budget. I've decided that it's not appropriate. The language is narrower than I had remembered it to be. And secondly, we do have funds for placemaking in the plan department budget. And so the funds are already available. So what we can do is we can adopt this. We can get the session settled for sometime in October or November and be well on our way as we go into 2018. And with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions. Also, Tarek from the NRTs is here, and we got some other city staff who work in this area. Alderman McKinney?
I'm going to direct my question to Tarek. And in your experience, specifically in the Park Edge, Park Ridge neighborhood, because that's where I'm most familiar, how do you see this fitting that neighborhood in light of key elements that have come to fruition in that particular neighborhood?
Sure, I think a good example might be the park, that we talked about over time, or Griff's that's getting turned into the employment center. I mean, a big consideration is just providing those opportunities for people to come together and engage in these ongoing conversations and planning efforts, and from that, really sowing the seeds for that kind of social fabric to come together. And so I think the idea is, if we're able to go out and actually identify some of the folks that are taking more vested interest in their neighborhood, provide them with some of the skills and the tools that they might need, and then ultimately have city ready there to support them in that effort, that they'd be part of the conversations in just fundamentally more ongoing way, getting more involvement in some of the initiatives that might be able to take place. So whether that's the park design, whether that's something like turning Griff's into the employment center, but I also think about it in some other much more organic ways, like what are the types of things that they might want to come together around. And so when I think about placemaking, I also think about some of the things that are some of the more temporary items, like frankly, some of the events when you come together and you throw together a block party and shut something down, a street down for an evening, and a lot of people are able to come out and enjoy each other's company, and that's part of what is I think can provide some of the long-term just kind of neighborhood building and community building.
Can I expand on that for a moment? I want to use 3 reference points. First, we missed an opportunity to have done a good placemaking job with the splash park. Now, the neighborhood requested the splash park. City Parks responded, and we built the splash park, and we acknowledged the priorities of the neighborhood. But what we didn't do from start to finish is have the neighborhood actively involved every step of the way in terms of participation. If we had done that, we might have seen some neighborhood leadership emerging that we would have today. So that's an example of something that might have been a great placemaking activity, and at the same time, the way we did it shows how government can be responsive but not have that kind of level of engagement of the neighborhoods. We did a good job in responding on the splash park, but we didn't have the engagement. Second example, which shows part of the problem and the challenges of placemaking, is Griff's. Because Griff's is really not just a neighborhood facility, but it covers an immense area with this employment activity. So that would not necessarily be a great activity. And then the third thing is that with the notion of quicker, cheaper, lighter, something as small and simple and inexpensive as block parties may be an example of a placemaking event. And one of the things that we're detecting already in the many proposals we've gotten in the last year on block parties as neighborhood-based activities, setting up a block party in a relatively low-income neighborhood compared to a middle or upper-income neighborhood is a very different activity. Why? Because if it's a neighborhood with extensive experience and financial resources, they know how city government works, they know how to get the permits, and the cost of the permits is not an impediment. But if it's a low-income neighborhood without that experience, it's much more challenging. And so it's very possible that one of the kinds of projects that we might see coming out of a placemaking activity, should we go forward with this, would be for one or two of the neighborhoods to get together and basically start identifying from their perspective how we don't respond properly in that kind of activity, and we end up with the challenges that we're seeing now on block parties. Sorry for that long answer, but I just wanted to expand on it.
So I'm going to spend a little time dissecting this. And the reason that I'm going to spend a little time dissecting it, I want my colleagues to know how important it is to pass this on. And I'm going to start, Mayor, where you were talking about block parties and events and bringing neighbors out. And so that's a good concept. And I'm going to contrast that. Down in one neighborhood, down in the Jeffy Trail area, when they have a block party, it's a social event. There's a lot of camaraderie. Parents and children come out and they enjoy that space and they build that relationship. When we have a block party in the neighborhood that I'm addressing, Park Ridge, that is challenged, we have to spend some time in developing that concept because neighbors are so siloed that they don't come out. So we can build that. I think that that is absolutely a good opportunity for our neighbors to get to know neighbors, but that's not going to happen overnight. And so I support their activities, but I am also supporting something stronger than that. And I went through, so let me talk about where the city hit the bullseye with the Park Ridge Employment and Training Center. The city absolutely hit the bullseye. So when I came on board as an alder and I asked about the community engagement, the neighborhood meetings that talked about grifts, and I was told, yeah, sure, we had neighborhood meetings, but I wasn't asking the right question. The right question was, how many showed up? 2, none, 3. That was the right question. But we got it right this time because neighbors, the NRT, the Urban League went out and talked with neighbors. They went to the West Fest and went where the neighbors were and really engaged the neighbors and asking them, what is it that you want to see in this community? What do you need? And we did it over and over. And on one session, we got over 100 people to respond. There were 3 or 4 community events where neighbors came and filled the room. They owned it. They picked out the colors, everything related to the employment center, the neighborhood, the neighbors picked that out, and they were really engaged. Where we did not, and I realize that that is something that we should have done, is that when we captured that energy, we should have continued to build on that energy. So now we have to go back and start building it. So the city got that absolutely right. When that employment and training center happens at Griff's, there will be ownership there because neighbors said that this is what I want. This is what I want to see. This is what I'm missing. These are my challenges. So they'll own that. And so when you're talking about placemaking, on Saturday, I went out and took pictures in the Park Ridge Edge neighborhood. And I hope that those pictures were a part of our documents, but I see it's not on our desk. I went to 15 corners in that neighborhood, and there was trash, discarded mattresses, couches. It was unsightly. And as I drove through the neighborhood, I asked myself, would that neighborhood, would all of that debris and collection and discarded items, would that happen in my High Point Estates? So I drove through there. No. Would that happen in Hawks Landing? I drove through there. No. So when you're in the reason that I'm strongly supporting placemaking is that until we engage neighbors in terms of owning the space, I did not receive a call to say that there was mattresses on the corner or there was a discarded couch on this corner or I didn't receive one email from one person within that community outraged at the dumping. If that had happened in my other neighborhoods, my phone, my email would have been blown up. So what am I saying? Placemaking helps engage individuals to take ownership for the space in which they live. That is so important. So scripturally, we talk about giving a person bread as opposed to teaching them to fish. I see placemaking as teaching people who live in the community how to engage and be responsible for their neighborhood, to say this is my neighborhood. And so pride and all of those things that people who own that neighborhood, and so that's why I'm supporting this, and that's why I want to make sure that this body knows that when you talk about the first three whereases, whereas several neighborhoods are facing critical challenges, including rising gun violence and lack of connection to jobs and government services. And the second whereas is whereas community engagement is an important element in reducing violence and supporting beneficial community activities. And that third one really gets it, whereas placemaking is a process of people coming together to create vibrant public spaces at the heart of their community and gives community members an opportunity to participate directly in the betterment of the places that matter to them through ideas, plans, design, and through hands-on co-creation, day-to-day programming, and self-management. That's the crux of why we have to support this. And so we can allocate gun buyback, we can do the 15-point plan, we can do a lot of those programming. But until we start investing in human capital and engaging and empower the people who live in that neighborhood to claim that neighborhood, I think that we are spending money not wisely spent. So I'm strongly supporting and asking my colleagues to help usher this through, because we want a neighborhood that is vibrant. And the adjacent community to Park Edge, Park Ridge, and the Crossing, High Point Estates, there are probably at least 20 for sale signs that are going up. And people are saying, I want to get out of the neighborhood. So we have to begin to look at how we can change the dynamics of what is impacting. So I am absolutely advocating for the Park Edge, Park Ridge to be one of those placemaking, because when I drove through on Saturday and I took pictures of all of the things that were left on the curbside, and then I went to my own neighborhood, I was challenged to say we've got to do more. And so I wanted to bring that forward to really talk about why placemaking is important. Placemaking is giving individuals who live in the area, who live on the block, who live on the neighborhood, the skills that they need to reclaim their neighborhood. So I'm hoping that if there are additional questions, we can support that training. I absolutely am supportive of having training on the southwest side and including and collaborating there, because people don't stay in their backyard. And we can't have 4 or 5 of these trainings. And so collaboratively looking at how we can come together and do those training, I think that that's a great idea. I would not support planning, even though planning is exceptional in doing those training, because we need someone else, we need an organization that's outside the box. It's really hard if you are expecting to go in and train on something that you're not as familiar with. And so I do support having the outside agency to come in and do the training. And I also support that the staff and the neighbors not be together, because that dynamic will not be encouraging. So I do support that separation. And I would leave the $400,000 alone. I'm glad that you stepped away from that, because we've gone through enough with the $400,000 and the 15-point plan, and we don't want to co-create and start mixing that up together. This is something that will stand solidly on its own. This talks about public safety, it talks about reducing violence, but it's doing it in a way that's generically, and it's from the grassroots moving up. And so I ask my colleagues to help usher this on in the neighborhoods that are identified, so that we can begin to make some changes in our community.
Thank you. Further discussion on the question? Alderman Skidmore?
Thank you. I just want to follow up on that. I do support this, and I really support what Alderman McKinney has said. As a landscape architect, we've been doing this forever, and I can recall participating in the charrette for the State Street Mall back in the early 70s, and this was pre-Freeburg time even, where I think it was the old Woolworths, if I recall the space that the Art Center is in now, getting together as groups and having different individuals and groups come in and express their ideas and hopes and desires, and it was a way for the community to come together. So this is an ideal vehicle for this, and I agree with Alder McKinney and the mayor. I don't think this should be the $400,000 from that pot of money. I think this program stands on its own, and it's going to have a lot of benefits for a lot of communities, and this is a primary one, is to, get some cohesion within the neighborhood. So I urge your support on this. I like this idea a lot.
Alderman Rommel?
I guess I have some questions. I'm not quite there yet. So in 2013, we had an extensive process where we engaged the Project for Public Safe Spaces and staff. And I got Lisa to send me the notes. And a lot of that stuff is all the things that would be placemaking that we would still come up with now. And I'm just wondering what happened to that list. And I guess I'm a little frustrated that we would go all the way out back to them when your point, Mayor, was really good. We don't really have an extensive history of community organizing. So that seems to me a crux problem. How do we build that? Maybe this is the way, and I'm just not there yet. Everybody else is, but I'm not. But I just don't get the placemaking versus the community organizing. Because I had a really interesting conversation with somebody the other day, and they said, sometimes if there's not a place to hang out in a neighborhood, the gas station is the place to hang out. So not every neighborhood has a place that you could close the street and have a block party, I get you that, but it just doesn't seem like that places and things and events are always ready to be used and build it. So that's one point. And the other question I have is, so how do we then build that capacity? So they come and they do a couple workshops, then what? Because that to me is the key question. If we see this process as one of a public health model, how does that feed that public health model and bring us forward in ways I think that we want to pursue? I don't know if anyone has answers,
Well,
but these are the
I can-
questions I'm struggling with.
All right, I'll give you a couple of responses. First, one of the things I think we will have to do, separate from all of this, is we're going to have to talk about whether or not we need a shift in our thinking about community organizing. Now, I've got some serious philosophical problems with having the government do the community organizing. It's a contradiction. And that's why we haven't pursued it in the past. But we may have to go out there and look for partners who can take that on. And I see that as a very long and lengthy process. One that is not going to get us results within 6 months or a year. In terms of the issue of violence as a health issue, the Department of Public Health is working on some proposals along those lines right now. But going back to the 2013 sessions, if you were to look at who attended, that activity was heavily dominated by those very active, relatively affluent neighborhood groups in the city of Madison. And while we did make a good effort, and there was participation from some of the neighborhoods we're talking about, this is a very intensive focus on, we'll have to decide about, I keep saying 6 to 8, 10 to 12, but somewhere in that range of the neighborhoods which really have not been given these kinds of tools and these kinds of opportunities and these resources of our city government. I think if all three of these areas get greater attention in the future, placemaking, not just for the more comfortable neighborhoods, not just for the neighborhoods that have the largest proportion of white residents, a focus, which is something going on nationally now, on treating violence as a public health issue, and coming to some resolution on the community organizing piece, which again, I think it's tough for us as a city government to become involved in that, because the best community organizing is always done by people who are independent of government.
Can I follow up? So I have two different ideas. One is about trash. And I understand what you're saying, Alderman McKinney. I really do, because it's bigger than my example. But my little example, I thought, it might be illustrative. So there was a time before Union Corners was developed where car campers were living there. There were no places to put garbage at all. So people who are living in their vehicles start tossing literally their crap into that land. I asked more than once, could we install trash receptacles? And I was always told no, because people would dump there because, all these reasons. And I never once got any trash receptacles at this location. So, at some point if there aren't trash receptacles, people throw it on the street. So Do we need to go in all those neighborhoods and make sure there's enough trash receptacles? Maybe that's part of the answer. I know recently the Worthington Park Neighborhood Association got revitalized and is starting to like get, alive again. And I met recently with the newly elected neighborhood president. What did he want? He wanted trash receptacles between the gas station at Marquette and East Wash and the park, because people go to the gas station, or maybe they've gone to one of the places in the strip mall and they just throw their crap as they walk to the park because there's no trash receptacles. So I hear that. And I know I lost track of my other question, but I'll just stop for a moment while I try to remember.
Alderman McKinney, you had your hand up?
Yes, I did. Look, I'm a product of community organizing. And I say that I'm a product of that because, and we were trained, so when I say we, my local church, the Camellia Foundation came to St. Louis to organize, and they started with the local churches and empowering local members to get involved in their community. And so I was sitting on the back row, right? Not really engaged. And so what they came in with, and we had to have them to change their language because it was pretty crash, and we were church people, and so they had to change their model. But they did change their model to fit for us because, you don't come into a church setting and you don't use some of the things that they use. But through that process, we were able to organize 20 churches and lay people within those churches. And what we were able to do, this was the time when St. Louis was looking at the metro system, and they were trying to determine where the metro stops were going to be and the buses were going to be. And we found that none of the connectors were in poor neighborhoods. All of the connectors meant that you drove to this location and you got on the train. That was assuming that you had a vehicle. And what we were able to do is collaboratively say to the planners is that you must provide bus transportation where people who don't have vehicles can take the bus to the Metrolink and access that service. And so, so whether we call it placemaking, whether we call it community organizing, what I'm naming it is empowering people who live in the neighborhood to realize that they have power. And power is not a bad word when it's used in a good way. I looked at the CRC. I went to some meetings in the early organization when members came together in your community to talk about an issue, and they got organized. And when in organizing, you have a collective, stronger voice rather than you just saying, "Oh, I want a trash receptacle." That's just one voice. But when you have a collaborative, collective voice to say, "Look at us. We're here. We want you to look at this. We want you to identify this." That's what I'm looking at in terms of organization and grassroots organization. It might be, oh, let's clean our neighborhood up. That's a place. But more importantly, it is giving individuals who don't have the skills or don't have necessarily the tools that they need to say that I matter. And a lot of these neighborhoods that are targeted don't have a sense of my voice matters. And so that's why I think that we can look at whether we're going to call it placemaking, we can look at whether we're calling it community organizing. That's fine. But what we're doing is creating a tool that we're handing for the individuals to identify what in their neighborhood that they want to work on. What is it in their neighborhood? Even going through the process of getting a trash can, it's not easy going through and getting things done with city government. It's frustrating. If it's frustrating for developers and frustrating for planners and frustrating for people who work with the city all the time, Our neighborhoods, my neighborhood particularly, the one in the center of my district, don't have the skills to do that because they've had a sense of no one's hearing me and it doesn't matter and no one's listening. So if we can give that community those skills to get the attention of city government, I think that that's a good thing. And so I don't know if I answered that question, but that's the synergy that we have to create. There's no synergy in the community. It's a community that says it's a lost community. If I can get out of this community, I would, but I'm stuck. And so you have people who are afraid to come out into the courtyard, people who are staying in their homes and the homes that they're paying for. But there's a fear of violence surrounding their neighborhoods. And so this is a way of giving them a tool to work themselves out of that.
Alderman Skidmore?
Yeah, thanks. I want to follow up on that, and Alderman McKinney, you used a few different words than I do. I used vehicle, and I'll stand by that. Landscape architects have been doing this a long time, and the State Street Mall was a good example. And another better example is some neighborhoods west of the Beltline that are starting to organize now, and individuals who've moved in who didn't know each other are starting to talk about common issues. One of them is noise on a construction site. And they're starting to organize to come together, and they're finding that they have a collective voice, and they can call me, and as their representative, we talk, and they're starting to feel empowered. And that's a term that the mayor used at a recent press conference. And that's why I see that this is an important vehicle in many different ways in different neighborhoods. Individuals might feel like they don't have the opportunity or ability to express their opinion. It doesn't matter, or they might be afraid to. You fill in the blank for the reason. But when they can get together and have a collective voice and have somebody, the city elected officials or others listen, they feel more comfortable with that. And now I'm seeing neighborhoods which came to me for one issue or problem are now coming to say, well, can we get some park equipment? Sure, here's how we do it. We work together collectively. So this is a mechanism, and once that mechanism gets started, I think it'll be very effective. And Alderman McKinney, your examples about the neighborhoods in your district that don't have the problems because they get together and they can express their opinions, and the ones that have the problems are the ones that don't. So I see this as a very logical tool for many reasons, not just one issue, not just for violence, not just for cleaning up the trash, but it's a mechanism that's going to empower the neighborhoods to have a voice to be able to speak to the city. So I'm really wholeheartedly in support of this. So anyway, enough.
Further discussion, Alderman Rubin.
So I have a question. So this, what's in the attachment is what I've been paying the most attention to. It's what the project for public spaces, kind of how they envision the process. And to me, it's not totally clear, and maybe I can let go of that and it will come clear later, but I would really want to know more about how we engage the nonprofits that exist maybe already active in certain areas identified. For example, I think of Commonwealth Development on the southwest side, or Mentoring Positives in Darbo, or, there's obviously more than ones than I know about. So how do we help get them part of this? So we all are learning the skills, and they're helping to develop leaders as well as the neighbors, identifying neighbors they might have met. And so I just want to know if there's more of a refinement for this proposal that we can expect to see.
What specifically language are you referring to?
Well, they talk about the process. So, on number 3, it says jointly with NRT coordinator and possibly appropriate local nonprofit, who's that, develop criteria for participation. For the neighborhoods, who does that mean?
What they're talking about is finding the people in the neighborhood and identifying, they're talking about using local resources. For example, let's use something that you said, mentoring positives will grain. So if we're going to include the Worthington neighborhood, would have a good idea as to who are some of the people we should encourage to participate.
And just through my research, I learned that, for example, Goodman has a neighborhood organizing institute, and I asked Becky more about that. So are there ways that we can also grow our nonprofits to be better at community organizing, even though we're not going to tell them as government to go do it, but maybe there's an opportunity to add to that part of the.
Can I speak to that? I would hope that that is the direction that we're going. One of the things that I hear most is that programs, organizations come into the neighborhood and tell the neighbors, I know what's best for you. And then once they come into the neighborhood and tell the neighbors, I know what's best for you, and then they leave. And that's what I'm told. And so this is an opportunity, and we've said it, is that the people who live in the neighborhood participate. I think you get that part. And so your question is, how do we begin to expand that and go further? I'd like not for us to look at Commonwealth is doing good, they're doing a grassroots, and other organizations, they're doing grassroots, but it's not empowering the people who live there on a day-to-day basis. And until we start doing that, when these organizations have moved on to something else, it's not sustainable, because we didn't build the brick that we needed to build. The brick that we need to build is the neighborhood. The brick and mortar, just as we build a building, we have to build that also with community. So if we're looking at how do we sustain a community, we've not done a good job of building social and human capital so that when programs leave, that they can sustain it. So I think we're at the same point. Refining this is you asked some very good questions in refining this, but the concept is the same, is building a sustainable network of people that can engage and advocate for themselves. So I think we're at the same place, is this language getting to that? But we're not going to be able to get, and this is my opinion, is that we're not going to be able to wordsmith this exactly, but we have to agree upon will this accomplish the foundation that will help individuals who live in the community be more sustainable. So my issues may not be the issues on the north side. I mean, they will identify, but as Alder Skidmore said, is that once they're empowered to do this, which is simple trash collection, then they'll start looking around in their neighborhood and say, what else can we do? This really feels good to be in charge of our neighborhood. And then that's when the vision comes back, and ultimately they'll be saying is that this is our neighborhood, we've built it, we're proud of it, and you don't have the right to come in and tear it down. But we have to make sure that they get to that point where they can say to individuals who want to come in and dump, individuals who want to come in and bring their stuff into their neighborhood, they're able to do that because no one says, enough, you can't come in and do this, because they know who their next door neighbors are. Absolutely. But this is a foundation for us to start.
For discussion.
One last comment I think is appropriate as a follow-up, and I'm going to use what I would loosely say is a quote from the mayor at a couple of press conferences ago, and I recall you saying, and I wrote it down because I thought it was so significant, safe neighborhoods start with strong leadership within the neighborhood, community-based, community-led. This is about neighborhoods. This is not about, and I don't want to call them interest groups because, you know, they all have a very important role to play, but the people in the Walnut Grove neighborhood come together to look at what's important in their neighborhood, whether it's trash, safety, dogs in the parks, whatever, and they form opinions. They're not afraid to come together as a group. They don't always have consensus, but they express that opinion. They feel comfortable and safe doing that, and the more they feel empowered to do that, the more they're willing to take on. And Alder McKinney is right. You know, the trash is a good start, but then it's going to step beyond that. And you know, this is going to create a tool for those neighborhoods that are not together and cohesive yet to come together and have a collective identity and a collective voice. And that's going to help empower them to say things that they might otherwise not be willing or feel safe doing by themselves. So that's, you know, I really think this is the right way to go for many reasons.
Further discussion? Seeing none, the question before us is adoption. All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries. Can we take 22 and 23 together as single motion?
Move approval of items 22 and 23.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you.
We'll start with 23. Is that presentation?
All right, as we've done the last number of years, we're here before you to provide an update on where we're at midway through 2017. And we'll also touch on our financial statements for 2016, how we closed there, and then also touch on what the outlook is for the 2018 budget. So we issued our comprehensive annual financial report at the end of June, as we typically do, and that's a very good compendium of what actually our financial situation looked like on December 31st of 2016. And you can see that at the Finance Department website. Just some of the highlights. One thing that we concentrate on quite a bit because it's a part of our both our good financial practices, but also how we are, how our bond rating is put together. Our general fund balance is a little over $39 million. That's slightly less than 14% of the subsequent year's general fund expenditures. Our policy goal is 15%. And we've been falling slightly over the last couple of years. Primarily in this year because our expenditures exceeded revenues by a little over $400,000. The primary reason for that was the stagehands settlement, and we had to book the entire liability, the entire expense associated with that, which was a net increase of a little over $1 million. We were able to accommodate that within the budget, but it did mean we spent more than we took in terms of actual revenues. Some of our revenues were slightly off compared to where we were at in the budget. Another change, and this reflects a change in accounting standards, and that is we now have to carry on our financial statements our share of any asset or liability in the Wisconsin retirement system. Our share is about 1% of the overall pool, so any sort of shifts in overall investment performance relative to the overall liability of the retirement or pension payments over time does have an effect on the margin. So we went from a positive asset of a little under $40 million at the end of 2015 to a $25 million liability at the end of 2016, again based on performance. It doesn't really have a serious effect. We're, for the most part, almost 100% fully funded in the retirement system. We are in a much better condition than many states around the country. We're probably the top 1 or 2 pension systems in the country. This does have an effect in the enterprise funds in terms of their solvency from a asset versus liability perspective. That might translate in the future into additional need for revenue, but it isn't an issue at all at this point. It would be if it were to build up over time. The city also offers other post-employment benefits, otherwise known as OPEBs. That's another area under accounting standards where we've had to increase our reporting pretty dramatically. We do have a liability. That liability increased by a little over 10%. In 2016 to $33 million. Now, over 2/3 of that liability is related solely to the fact that we allow retirees to purchase health care at the same rate as active employees, and that's called an implicit rate subsidy. So in effect, we're providing a benefit to retirees, and we pay for that benefit through the premiums that everyone pays for health insurance. But that is nonetheless a liability, and we have to show it as such. The remainder of that liability is that we do actually provide health insurance for primarily public safety employees who retire between age 50 and 55, and the city pays for their health insurance until they reach 55. Another highlight is that our GO debt is about a little over $400 million, represents about a third of our maximum limit of 5% of equalized value under the Wisconsin Constitution. That's our maximum limit. We've been between 30 and 33% over the last few years. Obviously, that percentage is affected both by how much debt we're issuing, but also what is the performance overall of our tax base. So that's a quick summary, and we'll move on to the second quarter projections. So we've looked at 2 quarters of actuals now in the general fund and in other parts of the city budget. Right now, we're projecting about a $2.3 million surplus. About half of that is related to debt service. Our actual debt service in the general fund will be about $1 million lower than what we budgeted, and that is because in previous years, in some projects, we've borrowed more than what we've needed. That could be because the project isn't getting done or got done under budget. And so under federal tax rules, we have to apply that excess debt proceeds to debt service. And that is helping with our budget in this year. We have about $2 million of appropriation room, which is less than what we've seen in prior years under the Expenditure Restraint Program. That program requires that we hold our growth in spending to a certain rate, and in return, we get a $6 million payment from the state. On the expenditure side, we're projecting that will be about $1 million over budget, I believe. A surplus there, and that's primarily because of a non-personnel budget savings is offsetting some over budget areas in personnel spending and shortfalls in revenues that are actually being collected within agency budgets compared to what was budgeted. And then we're projecting about a little over $1 million surplus on the revenue side. We're seeing strong performance in the building permits compared to budget. I think year to date they're up about 20%. Compared to the prior year. And then state payments for municipal services came in a little bit higher than what we estimated in the budget. So that's helping quite a bit there. Laura will go through some of the details on that second quarter projection.
Great, so to break down the expenditure overview into those 3 categories, we look at this in terms of non-personnel, personnel, and then the revenue within agencies. So as Dave mentioned, in our non-personnel spending, we have a projected surplus of just shy of $4 million. Now, some of the factors contributing to that is first our snow budget. We're projecting a $300,000 surplus there. That assumes that we would have 3 additional snow events in the fourth quarter of 2017. We had 3 events in the first half of the year. Dave mentioned the $1 million surplus in debt. Another big piece contributing to the surplus here is our budget for the contracts within the Community Development Division. Now, what we're seeing there is that there is just this natural lag in the contracting process. So where we may have funds for various contracts encumbered, we don't get them all the way spent down within one fiscal year. So this is really just kind of a technical lag in lining up how we're spending money with the budget. This is something that we'll be seeing less and less of in the future, just as CDD syncs up their RFP processes with the city's budget to ensure that we're spending down as much of those contracts as possible within the year that they're budgeted. There's about $1 million of miscellaneous savings across all of the general fund budgets. Some of these items are inventory and work supplies, as well as utility and energy savings. And so we will just continue to work to true up those trends with actual spending. And then one deficit to note is within the treasurer's office. The expenditures for bank services and credit card charges are exceeding the budget. That's partially due to we overestimated the reimbursements from the enterprise funds for their portion of those services that they receive. Then moving on into personnel spending, we have a projected deficit here of $1.5 million. Now, really what's happening here is that we are seeing a surplus in our permanent wages and salaries that we have budgeted for staff, but that's being offset by these non-annualized pay types, which includes leave payouts, so the leave that we pay for individuals upon their retirement, or when we pay down to the ceiling that employees are allowed to carry, as well as the sick leave escrow payments that are made when individuals retire. We're also seeing a deficit in how time is charged across various funding sources. We're seeing that the general fund is picking up a larger share for staff time than what we had assumed in the budget. And then finally, we're seeing a $1.3 million deficit in overtime, which I'll go to in greater detail in a couple slides here. And then the final category here is revenues that are budgeted within our agencies in the general fund. We're seeing a deficit of $1.3 million. The largest driver there are assumptions for funding that gets transferred across other funds into the general fund, and we're seeing that some of those assumptions are overstated based off of actuals. Now, when we talk about what's happening with the city's personnel budget overall, when we look at the vacancies by month, we can see that our vacancies kind of peaked in April. We were at the lowest vacancy point in May when 4.5% of all of our authorized positions citywide were vacant. When we look at the trends from June to July, we're remaining pretty flat. We're at about 4% of our total authorized strength is vacant at this point. And you can see below some of the agencies that have the highest vacancy rates. And in some cases, these are relatively small agencies that have recruitments underway right now. In other cases, there are a number of long-term vacancies that departments have had. So I mentioned we're seeing a deficit in overtime, and this is largely happening within public safety. So looking at police, first of all, there's a $250,000 deficit in overtime spending there. Now, what I will say is that when we look at police overtime spending, it's very consistent through the first half of the year. It's very consistent with where we were a year ago. So we're not really seeing any large variations in overtime spending. But one thing to note is that there was a change in the contract that was negotiated with sworn staff and police that increased their ceiling for the amount of time that they can carry. And so what we're seeing is that more people are opting to take their overtime as leave rather than overtime pay. And what that means is that it's good news for our overtime budget. We're not paying out as much in terms of overtime, but it is creating a future liability for us, increasing the amount of leave payouts that we will have to fund in the future. Now, on the fire side, we're seeing a projected deficit of $1.2 million. And this is driven by a number of different factors. The first is related to paramedic training. So what we're hearing from the department is that there is an increased rate of burnout amongst their paramedics. So what they're trying to do is deal with that burnout by training additional staff to act in the paramedic rotation. Now what that means is that when they conduct those trainings, they're pulling people out of the rotation and they're backfilling those individuals with callback overtime. And so there was a paramedic training that took place at the end of 2016 and continued into 17, which put pressure on the 17 budget. And the department is planning to conduct another course that would begin in September and would take us into 2018. So that projected cost, $446, is related to the potential impact of that training course in September. Now, the department is also seeing a number of increased unplanned absences. Now, those absences are backfilled also with callback overtime. And so if the trends that they've seen through the first half of the year continue into the second half of the year, there will be an additional $140,000 of overtime related to that factor. And then finally, the other piece of the puzzle here is just their other overtime categories. They're to maintain their normal minimum staffing. But again, the biggest piece here is that they will have an academy later in the year, and they provide capacity to that through overtime. And so we're projecting that the additional cost there will be about $615,000. Now, these numbers here assume that we will spend the entire contingent reserve. And so, as you recall, we increased the contingent reserve to $1.5 million as part of the 2017 budget. And so you can see up through the council meeting last week, we have transferred just shy of $100,000 out of the contingent reserve, so we still have $1.4 million there. So it's great for us to continue to be conservative there, as we know that our margins are thin for risk that we may have to deal with in the second half of the year. So before you tonight, as our next item, is a mid-year appropriation adjustment. And what our goal here is to to get ahead of some of the technical adjustments that you would commonly see in the year-end appropriation, to avoid any purchasing issues that may come up within agency budgets as we move into the second half of the year. So what we're proposing in that adjustment is the bulk of it is really taking money that was budgeted centrally and distributing it across the agency budgets based off of actuals that we've seen. So the first category that you'll see in that resolution is to transfer $1.7 million to various agency budgets for sick leave escrow payments. Now, we have within the general fund $1.9 million budgeted centrally, and we're recommending that we would transfer 1.7 to those agencies that have seen the biggest sick leave escrow payouts through the first half of the year. That is something that we typically see those charges really hit during the first half of the year and really slow down during the second half, which is consistent with the city's retirement patterns. The next category is carry forward encumbrances. We budget $400,000 centrally for any contracts that may lag from one year to the next. And so from 16 into 17, there was just shy of $335,000 within the general fund that was carried forward. And so we'll distribute that to various agency budgets, and the balance from that will be transferred back into the contingent reserve. And then in terms of miscellaneous adjustments, still within the operating budget, we will need to take care of that deficit within the treasurer's office. So we're recommending a $200,000 transfer from the contingent reserve to fully fund those credit card and bank charges. Within CDA housing operations, they have additional grant revenue associated with the Section 8 Portable Housing Voucher Program. So that we're recommending that we would appropriate $400,000 in additional grant revenue and expenditures to keep that program going. And then on the capital side, there are a couple of cleanup items that need to be taken care of. The first is related to a project associated with the Meadow Ridge Library. That project is done, but there are $45,000 of unanticipated expenditures that need to be funded. We would be funding those through reserves in the Capital Projects Fund. And then the next item is related to the State Street and Small Cap TIF programs. Those are funded by TID 32, and we've seen, based off of the commitments that exist within that program, they are exceeding the budget currently by $260,000. So we would appropriate additional proceeds from TID 32.
I think we'll stop here if you have any questions on the mid-year appropriation resolution, since that is item 22.
I guess the small cap TIF thing, that just struck me, like, why, and the retail, like, can you go into more detail about that?
Matt might be able to, but just a general overview is that the program was very successful and was to some extent oversubscribed compared to what was budgeted.
Yes, thank you. So we had $440,000 budgeted in 2017 for both the retail grant program and the small cap TIF loan program. And we combined the programs into one budget item because we thought if one uses more and the other program uses less, in total, they would not exceed 440,000. And that number was based on the previous use of those programs, and we thought it was a reasonable dollar value. That being said, this summer, the early part of the year into the summer, we received significant applications for those programs that in total exceed the 440,000 budgeted by $260,000. Again, we didn't anticipate that, and we had a couple options at that time. One was we could have basically looked at the day that individuals applied for the funds and cut it off at the 440,000 that was budgeted. We did, though, in this case, have resources available through TID 32 to provide the funding for those additional projects. And given that that these individuals were making investments into homes and retail within that TID area, we decided as an alternative to honor those applications. And now we've closed the application cycle for both of those programs. So this 260,000 would fund the remaining projects of individuals that applied, and those programs will now be closed down at the end of the year through the closure of the TID.
Thank you.
Alderman Rivera.
Thank you. Thanks very much for this. It's always informative. I appreciate your suggestion, Dave, of having this presentation before we actually got to the mid-year appropriation adjustment resolution, since all my questions are being answered through the presentation. So I'm going to go in order of the slides. I know the slides aren't numbered, but I have the first three questions are on the slide entitled Expenditure Overview. And so in the non-personnel spending tab category, could one of you please elaborate a little further on the bank and credit card charges? I appreciate that the explanation is that it was simply kind of a enterprise fund. The allocation among enterprise funds wasn't perhaps accurate in our adopted budget. Is it one enterprise fund in particular? Is it all enterprise?
Yeah, it's primarily water, so we expected more credit card charges that would be paid by the water utility than what has actually happened. And so as a result, the general fund share is higher than what we expected.
I see. So the general fund, the overall amount that we're paying, I think it's U.S. Bank is our processor generally, the overall amount
Is roughly what we thought it would be.
It's just that it's
the mix
less,
is a little different.
less municipal services bill.
Right.
I get it. Thank you. And then over on the personnel spending and kind of the big issue with the mid-year appropriation adjustment resolution, of course, is the health insurance benefits being paid upon retirement for our employees and the leave payouts. Is that, can you speak more generally about that? Is it because we've experienced much more retirements than we thought, or was it simply not something that bold, and it was just that we didn't budget appropriately?
Yeah. When we look at what we're paying in terms of the health insurance benefit for our retirees, we're pretty close to budget. I mentioned we have a $1.9 million budget in the general fund. I would say we're projecting will be about 2.1. So in terms of what we're paying out for their health insurance piece, what we're seeing is slightly over, but not a ton. Where we're seeing more pressure is in the leave payouts, and the greatest piece of that is really in public safety, as those individuals in those agencies are allowed to carry larger and larger leave balances. We're seeing that those actual amounts that are hitting those usually hit at the end of the year. We're seeing that those exceed the budgeted amount. So we continue to work with fire and police to figure out the best way to project those expenditures. A lot of those have been things that have traditionally been taken care of in the year-end appropriation. And we may have to come back and do some additional modifications to budgets based off of refining these numbers as we move to later in the year. But I do see that is an area that we may have to look at what we're increasing in the base budget as we move forward.
So the sick leave escrow experience that we've had thus far this year is on par with prior years?
It's what we're paying for their leave in terms of converting that to wages. And that's for retirees as well as active employees when we pay them down to their ceilings.
I see. And again, you think, even though you list here, obviously several agencies in the appropriation resolution, it's, the big drivers are fire and police, and that's, again, in part because of the collective bargaining agreement changing?
Well, that piece there, that would be their health insurance piece. The agencies that we are recommending that receive transfers as part of the mid-year are those agencies where their sick leave escrow payments are causing them to have a deficit. And so obviously you see the biggest pieces of that are police and fire, and they also represent a very large portion of the workforce too. So that would be what we would expect to see.
So what you're saying, just so I understand this, and maybe everyone else gets it, but I don't, is that this is something that we generally see year in and year out, but what's different is that you're doing it mid-year for the first time ever.
Every year.
Instead of the year-end appropriation.
Right, every year we're distributing money from the sick leave escrow. We always do it in the year-end appropriation. This is the first time in a long, long time that we've done sort of a mid-year
Yeah, I
appropriation
can't remember us
adjustment.
ever doing a mid-year appropriation.
So rather
resolution
than wait
before.
till year-end, we're distributing the sick leave escrow at mid-year. That'll help with the overall sort of budget levels in many of these agencies.
But it has caused deficits in a myriad of agencies every year, at the end of the year.
Right, as we get, usually we just go over and we let that happen in our old system. As we move to the new system, we're trying to tighten up, making sure budget and what we're getting in actual are much closer.
So it really isn't that more employees, we've experienced more retirements the beginning of this year. It's just as much as you said, Laura.
Some of it's
Current
just-
employees that are being paid out.
Sure,
Because they
it's-
reached the cap.
Some of both, yep.
Okay. Then moving on to your last item on this slide, the agency revenue projections. Can you please give an example or two of the transfers from other funding sources into the general fund?
Yep, so in various agencies, they may have assumptions that they would be transferring funding from the capital projects fund into the general fund for work that is incurred as part of their operations to support capital projects. Now, what we're doing more and more in our new financial system is charging all of those expenditures directly to the capital budget, thus avoiding the need for the transfer of funding. And so a variety of these amounts that are baked into the budget are things that we are working to clean up in agency-based budgets because they're not real. Other cases may be transfers into the general fund from various grants for the same reason, to recoup the general fund for charges associated with the grant. As we move more and more to a direct bill methodology, we need to eliminate those revenue amounts that are baked into the budget.
So of this $1.3 million deficit, would you say that most is capital projects?
Probably, I would say about between a half and 2/3 would fall into that category.
Okay, thank you. And then moving to the public safety overtime slide, please. I appreciate what you said, Laura, about the police department is consistent except for the MPPOA collective bargaining agreement modifications. So concentrating on fire, can you articulate how the fire's deficit, which is obviously a large number that you project here, how that's compared with prior year levels?
So this deficit is much greater than what we have seen in 15 and 16. So the paramedic training piece of this is something new that Fire has the class that they had in September and the one that's planned for later this year. Those are new strategies that the department is pursuing in order to get at the paramedic burnout. And so I think the other, and as well as the increased absences. So when we look at sort of their regular overtime for the normal minimum staffing, the recruitment training, all of that is pretty consistent with what it's been last year. What Fire is telling us that is not consistent with what they've seen in the past is the increased pressure from unplanned absences and the work that they are doing around the paramedic training program.
Is there anything more you can add that you've heard from fire staff, since they're not present tonight, as to why they believe they're seeing so much more burnout amongst their paramedic rank, and then further the unplanned leaves generally from the firefighter paramedics and regular firefighters?
I think on the paramedic side, that's something they're still looking at. What they're finding is particularly newer members of the fire department, of the sworn staff, are taking leave at a much higher rate than they've seen before. Maybe what used to be 3 days a year has increased on average to 6 days a year, and that's just something they just haven't seen before.
Are medical calls on the increase this year? Did they mention that in your conversations?
I think the medical calls have increased. I mean, we look at that on the ambulance fee side, and they don't appear to be any different.
Appreciable.
Right.
So we're working with the fire department now to look at how can we plan for this in 2018, especially in light of receiving the SAFER grant and the timing of those individuals coming out of the academy versus the timing of the opening of the new facility. How will all of these things kind of come together to maybe lessen some of the pressure that we're seeing on overtime this year?
The last question on the fire department, again, I don't know if you can answer this one, but in your conversations with fire, have you heard of any difficulty they're having? Volunteers respond to the callbacks needed to fill these vacancies?
No, we haven't heard anything of it.
Okay.
No,
So-
what it may be is generational. Discussed it with the chief today. And, in the past, senior officers have basically really emphasized with younger officers the importance in not using sick leave, and basically, unless you simply cannot come in, physically come in. Now, a couple of years ago, for example, we had a problem that year. A large number of firefighters didn't get flu shots. And so we've addressed that. We're getting much higher rates of flu shots. But it just appears that among the newest hires that they are taking sick leave at a much greater rate, though there doesn't seem to be any extraordinary explanation in terms of illnesses. So chief is going to be talking to the union talking to new firefighters, and just trying to really emphasize that. We talked a little bit about the extraordinary number of calls that are a result of the shootings and the stabbings, and that has increased demand, but that does not seem to have had much of an effect on absenteeism or on exhaustion or anything of that sort.
Stress.
Stress, yeah. I mean, you as the chief put it, you take a period where you had, say, 6 homicides in a year and little else. You divide that between A, B, and C companies, divide that among the number of vehicles that we've got responding, and statistically, it was very unlikely for most firefighters, most paramedics, to be called to a specific scene. Now, that has increased, but that, again, there's no evidence yet that that's having a bearing.
Thank you. Thank you all. Those are all my questions thus far.
All right, so now we'll move on to the outlook for 2018. And on this slide, kind of give you the overview of where we think the changes are from the 2017 budget. And I'll just start at the top of that table. Each of those are sort of the major revenue categories. They total a little under 2.7 million, and the red means to the good. So we'll have 2.7 million more of revenue in 18 that we're projecting compared with 2017. In payments in lieu of taxes, the primary growth factor there is the water utilities pilot payment, and that's affected by both whatever the tax rate's going to be and the amount of construction projects in the pipeline that adds to their overall asset base. Room tax, again, the general fund gets 30% of the growth in room taxes, and we are projecting some growth there, although we continue to look at the room tax closely. We'll have second quarter actuals this week. The first quarter was very weak. It actually was lower compared to the prior year, so we're watching that closely. Charges for services up slightly. Licenses and permits, that's going to be primarily stronger building permit numbers. State aid, the state aid number embeds in it $750,000 that the city would see if the general transportation aid amount proposed in the governor's transportation budget were ultimately adopted by the legislature. Obviously, the legislature has not passed the budget, so we don't know if we will get that increase in state aid. That's at least roughly half of that amount. The other half is the payment for municipal services, which is breaking higher for the city. And we have some other minor adjustments. So 2.7 million higher on the revenue side. On the expenditure side, we have to fully fund the staffing for both Fire Station 14 and the Midtown Police Station. This also incorporates into it what is actually an added cost by getting the SAFER grant because we have to associate it with a recruit class and things like that. Debt service, we expect that to be up 4.4 million. That's based on what we plan to borrow in September, which will total about $100 million of GO. Pay and health insurance, we have to fully fund the pay increase that was provided last month, as well as we've built in a pay increase, a small pay increase for 2018. We assume health insurance will go up about 5 to 6%. We should know those actual numbers by the end of this month. We do know the retirement system payouts and or what we have to contribute to the system, and that's roughly unchanged from this year. This slide does assume, or these assumptions do build in, that the money from the room tax that was used in 2017 this year to pay for the subsidy, the Old Brick Gardens, and to the zoo would return to the general fund and not be paid by the room tax going forward. We have other costs to continue. So for example, we have a full election slate in 2018, so we have to add dollars to the clerk's office to pay for that. We expect some savings in fleet, primarily in our depreciation calculations. And then we have other adjustments that we've built in. A lot of that is referring back to what Laura said earlier, cleaning up some revenue problems within agency budgets on an ongoing basis. So we have total expenditures of a little under, or around 17.7 million, and our maximum allowable levy under the state levy limits, we estimate right now is about 11.5 million. You put all those numbers together, we have a gap right now of about $3.5 million before we get to a balanced budget. Now, the left hand of that panel gives you a sense of what does that mean. We would have a levy increase of slightly over 5%. Taxes on the average value home, that's what TOA stands for, would go up 3%, or about $72 on that average home, which is about $269,000 in value. Our value is going up over 8%. That's very good news. It's driven by large increases in commercial valuation as well as stronger residential values. Average value homes up about 6%. All that together means that the tax rate could go down, at least the tax rate for the city government, down 2.7%. Now, what the assessor just told us a few weeks ago is that a lot of that commercial value growth has happened within TIDs, primarily within TID 32. And we see the TIF values, the incremental values, up 60% overall. So it's a pretty dramatic increase. And the net new construction's up 3%. Just as an aside, what that means in TID 32 in its extra year for affordable housing is it will probably spin off about $13 million for affordable housing. So it's a pretty dramatic number. So that's the big picture on where we're at right now in terms of the outlook for 2018 and what the mayor is working with in offering his operating budget in early October.
So again, just walking through those expenditure elements in a bit more detail. As Dave mentioned, we're projecting that debt service will increase by about $4.5 million in 18 over 17. This will represent about 15.5% of the total general fund budget, up from 14.8 in our 17 budget. In terms of salaries, we're projecting a $3 million increase, and this includes not only the continuation of all the planned contract increases and the annualization of those increases, but it also includes all of the step and longevity increases for our employees based off of where they are in terms of their longevity. In terms of health insurance, the $2 million projected increase assumes a 5% rate increase. If we look at what the average was from 2011 to 2015, there was an increase of about 5.2% annually. We will know these final rates later in August, and as Dave mentioned, the WRS rates will remain relatively flat in 2018. The next piece that we have factored in is around workers' comp. We're projecting a potential $1 million increase, and this is really driven by increased claim costs. And what we're waiting for as we refine these numbers is additional analysis from the city's actuary about what we should be projecting in regards to our outstanding claims. In regards to room tax, again, we're projecting a $640,000 increase, and that would assume that we would be fully funding Olbrich and the zoo from room tax or from the general fund, and those particular items would not receive any subsidy from the city's room tax. Cost to continue is $925,000. Now there's a number of factors here. We have a couple of active COPS grants, and so we would need to increase the local match for those. Now I will note we do have an outstanding application for a new COPS grant, and that is not reflected here anywhere. So that would add to the gap in 18. We have added $500,000 for costs associated with the 2018 election cycle. If you all recall, we added $80,000 to the 2017 budget for the first phase of transitioning to a $15 minimum wage. So we would be adding another $80,000 for the second phase of that ramp up. We do have an assumption here to increase sick leave escrow payments by $300,000. Now, based off of what we're seeing with more refined numbers, we may not need that funding for sick leave escrow payments, but we could definitely use that for the leave payout portion that is under budgeted currently based off of current trends. We do have factored in a $500,000 increase to the overtime budgets for both police and fire. Now, if we looked at the 15 and 16 trends, that would make them whole, but obviously that doesn't account for the increased overtime spending that we have seen as we move through the year in the fire department. And then, again, some good news here is that we will have $600,000 of savings in the fleet rate and general fund agencies, and that's based off of the estimated depreciation based off of the assets that folks will have next year. The next piece is the Midtown Police Station. So that is approximately a $1 million increase in 2018. So that includes annualizing 7 positions that were authorized as part of the police department's academy that will take place later in this year, as well as creating 2 additional positions in anticipation of the station opening. So under the current timetable, the new facility will be open in September or October of 2018. Fire Station 14, we did hear recently that we were the recipient of a SAFER grant that will help offset the cost of opening that station. What we have factored in the budget is the creation of 18 new positions. We are assuming that those, we would start an academy in January. And so the $750,000 increase here is the general fund share of that. That would be offset by our first year of the SAFER grant. And then finally, in terms of technical adjustments, this is largely the product of our quarterly analysis as we go through agency budgets to really try to true up base budgets with actual spending patterns. When we now look at 15 and 16 and midway through 17. A number of the factors that that make up this amount here are what we're assuming in terms of budgeted salary savings and making sure that those amounts are consistent with agency staffing trends. Really tightening up how we assume time that is charged to capital or other funding sources to make sure that how we're allocating those dollars in the budget is consistent with what is planned and prior year trends, and then really honing in on the revenue amounts that are budgeted within agencies to ensure that those amounts can be actualized. I just want to touch on key dates, and then we can answer any questions about 2018. So you will see the mayor's executive capital budget introduced at council on September 5th. We then have finance committee hearings on the executive budget scheduled for September 11th and 12th. There will be a public hearing regarding the executive budget on September 19th. Your proposed amendments to the capital budget will be released on Friday, September 22nd. The Finance Committee will vote on those amendments at the September 25th meeting. The executive operating budget will be introduced at Council on October 3rd. Our hearings at the Finance Committee are scheduled for the 9th and 10th. There will be another public hearing on the budget on October 17th. The operating amendments from the Finance Committee will be released on the 19th. We will vote on those on October 23rd, and council adoption is slated for November 13th and 14th. One thing I just want to note, due to sort of the space constraints of this room in anticipation of a number of your colleagues joining us for these meetings, we will be moving our budget meetings to council chambers. So all of the meetings that you see slated here, with the exception of September 12th, will take place in council chambers. So there is an error on the announcement on tonight's agenda. It incorrectly states that we'll be in council chambers on September 11th. And so we will be on the 11th, we will be in here on the 12th. So I'll send a clarifying note out to everybody so that we all know what room we'll be in. But for our meetings, for the bulk of our meetings in September and October, we will be down in council chambers to have a little more space.
Thank you for finding more humane space for us.
Great.
The only thing I'd want to add to all of this is we've spent a good deal of time in discussions over the last 6 months with the healthcare providers and with the folks at ETF who do the work on the state health insurance plan. And we're hoping, as usual, because we have been fortunate the last several years, that perhaps that'll have had some effect, and we'll see lower than the expected 5% in terms of health insurance costs. If we don't see that, we're going to be very hard pressed to make up that $3 million. Questions? We have a motion to adopt the 22, right?
Both, I think we moved both.
Yeah, they were both moved.
Pardon?
They're both moved, but the only
Yeah.
actions on 22.
Alderman Rivera?
Thank you. I'll just keep myself to one question on 2018 preview. Have you had any initial projections for our insurance costs for next year? Workers' comp is mentioned here, but given the very high profile claims we've had, litigation, et cetera, what's the timing of when we find out how that impacts our insurance fund, et cetera? And have you had any initial projections at all?
That's something we continue to work through. It's probably going to be a multi-year effect on our liability insurance in particular. And I would say in the short term, we're probably not going to see a dramatic increase in what we're going to have to pay in premiums. I think the larger issue will be in future years, the extent to which in the public safety area we're forced by WMIC, our insurance provider, to take a higher retention level, essentially a deductible. Right now, we have a $350,000 retention, which means we pay the first $350,000 of costs. That was increased just over the last year or two from $300,000, basically in response to our experience. Many insurance plans for public safety employees have a retention as high as $1 million. So that could be something we see in the future from WMIC as they look, and not just WMIC, but the reinsurers that WMIC uses to cover the higher layers up to the $10 million of total coverage that we have. So we could see pressure because of our claims experience with a higher retention rate.
But your projection, Dave, is that there won't be a dramatic increase, you believe, at this time on the 2018
We don't at this
operating
time,
budget?
right? And we continue to look more closely at workers' comp. That number we put in, at least for planning purposes, because of some very costly workers' comp events that occurred in the first half of this year.
Is that across several agencies or one or two?
Basically
agencies?
one event in one agency.
Which is that? Which agency?
It was in streets.
Streets?
Yep.
Oh, the incident that was on the, I understand, on Badger Road.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Appreciate this again very much. Thank you.
My one question is, we're going back to the increased premium, you called it retention, was at $300,000 and it went up to $350,000. Any settlement of claims, that decision is made by the insurance company, whether to move forward, settle, so we don't have any input in that decision process, is that correct? Or say more about that, probably, is my question.
We're engaged in the discussions, but ultimately the insurer makes the decisions because they're the ones who will pay out above that retention level. And in addition to our insurer, WMIC, the reinsurer is also involved heavily in those discussions because they're the ones who are paying at those much higher levels between $1 million and $10 million. So I think you have to keep in mind, we're not just dealing with one insurance company, it's multiple insurance companies who may also be reinsuring with other companies around the world in some respects, and their legal counsel are also analyzing what might or might not happen within a certain case.
Other questions or discussion on the motion? All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed, no? Motion carries. Thank you. At this point, we'll take a motion to go into closed session for item 24.
I move that we go into closed session. When the Finance Committee considers the following item, it may go into closed session pursuant to 19.85, 1 sub 1 sub G Wisconsin statutes, which reads as follows. Conferring with legal counsel for the governmental body who is rendering oral or written advice concerning strategy to be adopted by the body with respect to litigation in which it is or likely to become involved. If the Finance Committee does convene in closed session as described above, upon completion of the closed session, notice is hereby given that it may reconvene in open session to consider the following item without waiting 12 hours pursuant to Wisconsin statute, section 19.85 sub 2.
Second.
Motion is second. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Oh, roll call, I'm sorry.
McKinney?
Here.
Rummel?
Yes.
Yes.
Skidmore?
Yes.
Verveer?
Aye.
Wood?
Okay, we're on again. So, we did not take any action. Motion to adjourn is in order?
Move adjournment.
Second, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, no. Motion carries.
Thank you.